Chapter 19. An Encounter and an Inspiration. The two cousins smiled timidly at Nancy. Then, as if remembering instructions, they drew themselves stiffly erect, their noses in the air. Sorrow tugged at Nancy's heart as she found herself snubbed once more for reasons that really mattered not at all either to herself or to her former chums. Impulsively, Nancy put her hand on Bess's arm gently. "Bess," she said softly, "I have done nothing to you. Why must our friendship be broken because of a foolish quarrel that persons now dead had 50 years ago?" To Nancy's surprise, a big tear rolled down Bess's cheek. The girl shook Nancy's hand from her arm and turned her back, but her head was bowed and a sob shook her shoulders. George, meanwhile, bit her lip nervously, glancing from Bess to Nancy. "We can't help it, Nancy," she said finally. "Your father is doing his best to keep our family from its just share in the estate." The floor where women's clothing was displayed was reached, and Nancy suggested to Bess and George that they all sit down together in the lounge provided by the store for the comfort of weary shoppers. "Let's talk this over a little," she said. "You should get acquainted with Sadie, too. Even if you decide not to remain friends with me, it won't harm you to know Sadie better." Hesitatingly, the cousins agreed, and soon the four girls, all but Nancy feeling acutely uncomfortable, were gathered in a corner of the restroom. "Bess, you and George met Sadie the same evening I did," Nancy said. "We were all together then. It was the first time any of us met Mr. Sidney. Although he was a distant relative of you both, you had never heard of him. Isn't that so?" Bess and George nodded, and Nancy continued. "Sadie knew my father was a lawyer because I told her so. You were both with me when I told her, I think. It doesn't matter, because the only reason why I happened to mention it was to tell her there might be a way to trace her parentage. The very next morning, after our visit to the Twisted Candles, Sadie telephoned to me and said that Mr. Sidney had asked her to find a lawyer, and the only one she knew about was my father. Mr. Sidney wanted to make his will and seemed perfectly competent to do so. He didn't seem to you to be unbalanced, did he?" Bess and George looked at each other uncomfortably, then shook their heads in unison. "It is my father's duty to carry out his client's wishes," Nancy went on. "He is legally bound to do so. He could be disbarred and thrown out of his profession if he did not do it. He would have to apply to the courts for permission to abandon the trust and give good reasons for quitting. That is my side of the story. Sadie's is just as simple. Ever since she was just a little girl, she has waited on Mr. Sidney, up until the day he died. He chose to make her his heiress. It hasn't brought her happiness. I know Sadie would rather know who she is and who her parents were than to have every cent of Asa Sidney's money without dispute." "Oh, that really is true," Sadie cried sincerely. "I know the story of the family feud," Nancy continued. "Now everyone who participated in the original quarrel is dead. Why should we let the foolish anger of persons who are no longer living come between us?" "Nancy," George said with decision, "you are right. I might add that you are right as usual. I, for one, am sorry and ashamed. Please accept my apology and take me back as your friend. And what is more, I shall tell Great Uncle Peter at once that I have apologized to you." Bess, the plumper and more sensitive of the cousins, was frankly weeping into her handkerchief. "Oh, Nancy," she said, laughing through her tears. "I'm so glad we are friends again." Nancy laughed aloud in sheer joy, and the others joined in. Women looked at the quartet with smiles, perhaps wondering what innocent little joke was amusing the young people. "What are you shopping for?" George asked. "We always have so much fun buying things together." "Sadie wants to get some new clothes," Nancy explained. "Want to help?" "May we, Sadie?" Bess asked. "I'd be very glad if you would," Sadie replied, smiling happily. "I really don't know much about styles." When the store closed that evening, 4 gay young women left its portals, chatting merrily and laden with bundles. Sadie had been re-outfitted from top to toe in attractive clothes which wrought a transformation in the thin, wan-looking girl. She seemed to have gained self-confidence with her new attire, too, but she was not yet entirely at ease. "Please don't go far from me," she whispered to Nancy. "I'm afraid the Semets may grab me or do me some sort of harm." "Don't worry," Nancy said airily, although privately she admitted to herself that Sadie's fears were well grounded. Frank Semet would not be above kidnapping Sadie, she believed, or, more cannily, swearing that he was her legal guardian and getting a court order to put her in his power. "We shall have to find out who Sadie really is," she decided. "That will be a big help." After dinner at the Drew household, Nancy helped Sadie unpack her new wardrobe, and they admired all over again each item of dress. "I don't want to bring up anything unpleasant, but do you remember the name of the orphanage from which the Semets took you?" Nancy asked. "I was certainly reminded of it often enough," Sadie replied with a trace of bitterness in her voice. "I don't know how often one or the other would tell me how grateful I ought to be and how much harder I ought to work because the Twisted Candles was paradise compared with the new Fernwild Orphan Asylum." "The new Fernwild Orphan Asylum," Nancy repeated. "Do you remember where it was located?" "No, except that it was somewhere in the east," Sadie replied. "I think that it was in New England or upstate New York, but I can't tell you how I got that impression. Maybe it is a lingering childhood memory." Long after the household was in darkness, Nancy lay in her bed and pondered the problem of establishing Sadie's identity. How that was to be done was not easily solved. Nancy fell asleep studying the problem and awoke the next morning with that uppermost in her mind. Mr. Drew took Sadie with him to the courthouse for certain legal formalities, leaving Nancy alone with her mystery. "I'll go talk with Raymond Hill," she decided. "He likes mysteries and is probably good at solving them. Besides, he used to live in New York State, I heard him say." It did not take Nancy long to act on an idea once she had formulated it. Accordingly, she was soon in her car speeding towards Smith's Ferry, where she found Raymond Hill at his desk in the bank. The banker greeted her heartily, but with genuine respect. There was nothing patronizing in his greeting. He spoke to Nancy as an equal, for she had demonstrated her courage and sagacity to his full satisfaction. "What new twist in the mysterious doings of the Twisted Candles brings you here this morning?" Mr. Hill asked, firmly shutting the door marked private. "Just a hunch," Nancy said. "Do you know where New Fernwild is?" "New Fernwild? By Jove, that sounds familiar. I have certainly heard the name often," Mr. Hill said, as a smile of hope lighted up Nancy's features. "Let me look in the government postal guide." From his bookcase, the banker took down a thick volume which, he explained, contained the name of every town and hamlet in the country, listed by states and also alphabetically. "However, there seems to be no such place as New Fernwild listed," Mr. Hill said, with a perplexed frown. "I certainly have heard or read about it." "It is the name of an orphan asylum, Mr. Hill," Nancy said. "It may not be named after the town it is in. I guessed it might be, but if there is no such place as New Fernwild, it will be harder than ever to locate the institution." "Orphan asylum, repeated Mr. Hill, running his fingers through his hair. "I have it! Goodness gracious, what a strange coincidence!" He pushed the buzzer on his desk, and to the porter, who responded immediately, Mr. Hill ordered that the contents of a certain safety deposit box be brought to him. While waiting for the man to return, Mr. Hill drummed on the desk with his fingers, snapped them, whistled softly, and occasionally shot a searching look at Nancy under his brows. She did not break into his train of thought, although his conduct puzzled her considerably. "Why did you come to me with this question?" Mr. Hill asked suddenly. "The orphanage is the one from which the Summits took Sadie," Nancy said. "I want to find out for her who her parents were. I came to you because you were interested in the case, because I suspect you like mysteries. The way you picked me out as Nancy Drew the first time I came here convinced me of that, Mr. Hill. And because you once lived in New York State, where I think the orphanage is located. Nancy, you certainly have the best ordered mind and the keenest ability to put two and two together of any person I ever met," Mr. Hill said. "If you should decide to go into business, I'll make a place for you in the bank and guarantee that you will be an officer in 2 years. I mean it. I am not joking. I think you would bring us the business of every woman in the county and— Oh, Luther, there you are." The porter had entered and placed a huge bundle of legal-looking documents and leather-bound account books on Mr. Hill's desk. "Now let's see," Mr. Hill said, assorting the papers with a practiced hand. "These papers are part of the records of my father's estate." "Ah, yes, I knew it." Mr. Hill unfolded a sheaf of yellowed foolscap bound in blue paper like a lawyer's brief. "Papers of incorporation of the New Fernwild Orphanage," he read. "A charitable institution, not operated for profit or supported by taxes, to be maintained and directed by the League for the Friendless." "Now we are on the right track," Nancy cried, leaping to her feet in excitement. "How did it happen that you have this?" "My father was one of the trustees of the orphanage and president of the League for many years," Mr. Hill said. "Well, Nancy, what is to be done next?" "How long ago was your father associated with the asylum?" Nancy asked. "For many years, but he died 22 years ago." "That is too bad," Nancy said. "Will you please do this, though, because the present management will remember who you are and will respect your wishes. Please telegraph the orphanage and ask if a little girl named Sadie Whipple was a ward there 10 years ago. Ask under what circumstances she was removed." Nancy paused a moment, and Mr. Hill looked at her attentively, but when she spoke again, he leaned forward and slapped the top of his desk in amazement. "And ask," Nancy said, "if Asa Sidney, the famous inventor, was one of the contributors to the Society's treasury." End of chapter 19.